I'm Professor Alphonse Mpeke, the founder of COAFRWO-UK, the new Pan-African emerging science for decolonization, decoloniality, also restoration, justice, order, dignity, Renaissance, African Renaissance, and also the global African world order. Welcome to this lecture offered by the Institute of Contemporary African World Studies and the private company called GCSE in Ireland. On this lecture, I really want to open up an important conversation with African across the global sphere with this burning question. Can we decolonize Africa without first decolonizing ourselves as Africans in order to generate an African science of decolonization? We are entering in an era of decolonization, and this era of decolonization is risking to be jeopardized by discourse that are creating confusion between decolonization and decoloniality. Therefore, here we need to take control of this conversation, this debate that is now kind of circulating in Western university. So we get no confusion, no distraction as usual. But we start seeing the signs of the confusion with what we are going to use here as our case study, the state of Sahel in IVS. Greeting. The question is there. Let me repeat that question. Can we decolonize Africa without first decolonizing ourselves as African in order to generate an African science of decolonization? No. Africa cannot be decolonized without Africans first decolonizing themselves. Any authentically African science of decolonization requires a prior inner rupture. Why self-decolonization is indispensable. The sources consulted shows that political decolonization has never been sufficient to produce cognitive or scientific sovereignty. Mudimbe's analysis of the colonial library indicate that the category, concept, and frameworks of thought imposed by colonization continue to structure African thinking even after independence. This means that an African can be politically independent while remaining epistemologically colonized. Studies on decoloniality also highlight the need for internal self-critique. Decolonial movements themselves acknowledge that there are limits, often from the lack of inner transformation among the actors who carries them. So without inner transformation, we reproduce what we fight. Research on African social sciences shows that in the absence of a cognitive rupture, African universities have often continued to function as translation centers for European knowledge rather than as places where their own concepts are generated. In other words, we criticize the West using the Western tools. We think Africa using non-African categories. We produce knowledge that reinforces dependency. This is exactly what Sablo Dlovugatseni calls the unfinished decolonial turn, where Africa remains trapped in the cognitive empire as long as it does not reconstruct its own matrices of thought. Why this prevents the emergence of an African science of decolonization? A science never emerges. A science never emerges from rejections alone. It is born from an autonomous conceptual matrix as long as Africans have not, first of all, reactivated their own archives, reconfigure their mental schemas, rehabilitated their cosmologies, reconstructed their units of measurement of reality. They can only produce derivative science, never foundational science. Analysis of the 60 years following independence shows that the absence of this inner transformation explains why African states regain territories but rarely regain trajectory. Conclusion: decolonization begins in the mind before unfolding in institution. The sources converge. First of all, external decolonization without internal decolonization produces only surface sovereignty. An African science of decolonization can emerge only from an African cognitive refundation. In other words, you cannot decolonize a continent without first decolonizing the minds that must think it. For let's say, uh, as a next step, uh, we wish to suggest here a few steps that we believe should be considered. 6-axis conceptual architecture, African Sciences of Decolonization, ASD, a coafrological model, institutional and operational version. The first axis we're suggesting here, axis 1, is the inner decolonization, the cognitive self-sovereignty. The central thesis here is no African transformation is possible as long as Africans think with the categories of the others. This first axis aims to identify, first of all, internal colonial residues, language, hierarchy, imagination, epistemic reflexes, deconstruct the colonial library, Mudimbe, reactivate African connective matrices, the cosmotechnics, ontology, relational logic, operational output, decolonize, cognitive profile, DCP, the foundation of any African science. The second axis is the reconstruction of thought matrices, the African episteme. An African science cannot emerge without, first of all, reactivating African system of measurement, in bracket, the time, the space, the value, the energy. Reconstructing African logics, casualty, circular, relational, holistic, operational output. The African epistemic framework, AEF, the epistemic foundation of ASD. Axis 3, energy logic, recentering African vital power. Decolonization is articulate with your concept. It is articulate here with our concept of energy logic. Reconnection to African matricial energy, the normal Mahat, Ubuntu, Karma. The transformation of colonized psychic energy into creative energy. Transition from survival to projection, power, of self-definitions. The Operational Output Index of Sovereignty Cognitive Energy, the ISCE. The Axis for Coafrological Local Strategy, Territorializing Decolonization. Decolonization, let's say, decolonization is not abstract. It must become territorial. This, this axis enables, first of all, the creation of sovereign cognitive micro-ecosystems, for instance, villages, districts, university. Secondly, integration of local knowledge into public policies. Thirdly, construction of autonomous cognitive territories. And let's say the operational output here is mapping of African cognitive territories, in bracket ACT. The fifth axe, let's say production of African science of decolonization, ASD. This is where the science itself is born. Formalization of African concept into scientific tools. Creation of African models, theories, protocols, indicators. Institutionalization within African universities. Production of African research methods, ARM. The operational output here is African Scientific Corpus of Decolonization, in bracket ASCD. The sixth axis is the external decolonization, institutions, states, economy, technology. Only after the first five axes can Africa, first of all, decolonize educational systems, rethink political institutions, build sovereign technology, example, Box, Inomo, redefine African economy models. The operational output here is decolonize institutional system, DIS. The synthesis here is the direct answer to the question we're starting at the beginning. The answer is here, no, because one cannot decolonize Africa if one is not himself went through the process of self-decolonization. So, yes, no Africa cannot be decolonized unless Africans first decolonize themselves. External decolonization is only the consequence of internal epistemic, energetic, and territorial decolonization. An African science of decolonization can only emerge if Africans, first of all, liberate themselves internally, reconstruct their thought matrices, reactivate their cognitive energy, territorialize their sovereignty, produce their own science, transform their institution. So this is it. Thank you for watching, and we wish, first of all, you subscribe to this channel where we promote coafrology and the other matricial African new sciences. So please share this video as much as possible to all African scholars and African interested or thinking about really decolonizing not only their institution but themselves first. I wish you a lovely day. We say Ubuntu Kama. Bye now. You can drop your questions after this conference. I will respond to you and we keep this conversation going. Ubuntu Kama. Bye now.